Masters 2020 MUX-204, creating the optimal user experience. And normally we wait a little bit before we do a poll, but we're gonna have some fun, and we're actually gonna start the poll first before I even introduce anyone. So we're gonna go ahead and launch that poll. You should see that on your screen right now. Please feel free to answer that question. What is UX? And we're gonna go ahead and see how everyone does. We're very excited about the class today. We are joined by Ms. Karen Goldman. She is our Manager of User Experience and will be our instructor for today. Our co-hosts today are Mr. John Garcia, Technical Director of Crestron Canada, and of course myself, Richard Sasson, Global Director of Technical Services. We are joined with supporting team of Ms. Sherry Goldberg and Mr. Carl Walkovich, and we're glad to have them with us as well. And I can see that everyone is answering very, very quickly, which is wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the polling pretty quickly. Since 97% of the audience got the right answer, we're going to share those results and we'll move forward. And we're going to welcome Karen to the call. Karen, we're very excited that you could be here with us. You are new to the MTA program, and we're glad to have you participating and presenting. It looks like our audience believes they have an understanding of what UX is and the user experience. 97% of our audience did answer this one correctly, which is exciting. I think either the 9 people who answered user X were either having fun with us or just took it literal. So it's all wonderful. Having said all that stuff, Ms. Karen, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you go with this wonderful course on UX design principles and creating the optimal user experience.
Thank you, Rich. I'm Karen Goldman. I'm Manager of UX for Crestron. I'm so excited to have this opportunity to dig into what user experience means. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining. We have a lot of material to cover, so we're going to jump right in. Just real quick, what we're going to be going through today is the value and the benefits of UX. I want to talk about the difference between UX and UI. I know there's sometimes a lot of ambiguity in that area, so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how science meets art. So we're really going to get into the fundamentals of UX design, the psychology of UX. We're going to talk about user research in the form of user-centered analysis, user testing, and we're also going to talk about evidence-based that you can use when you don't have an opportunity to test with users. And then lastly, as we're moving towards this new HTML5 world, we're going to talk about how to really make sure that we're designing with the focus on our users. So let's jump in. So first thing I want to go over are the benefits of UX. Why do we do it? Why does it matter? So user experience has many benefits in terms of cost, the quality of our products, and of course, the crux of user experience is satisfying our end users. So by going through some of the processes that we're going to review today, we're going to talk about how this improves development productivity. We do what's called iterative design, which makes our designs more efficient, so we have fewer updates later. We really focus on the task of a user so that they can achieve their goals and meet their needs. So this helps to eliminate any over design. As I said, we do talk about doing iterative design, and this really helps to detect any usability problems early in the design process. And of course, when we have intuitive UX that's easy for our users, we're obviously going to have greater cost savings because we're going to have less calls for support, less training, and higher productivity for our users. So ultimately, we're increasing the satisfaction for our users, and this benefits not only the product, but our brand reputation. The next thing that I want to talk about is the difference between UX and UI. So we're going to dive into this. So UX, user experience, is what makes the interface useful, while UI, user interface, makes it beautiful. So if we could just go back one step, one slide, Rich. Thank you. So the two work together, but the UX is really where we look at how we're serving up value to the user. So this is where the research comes in, the information architecture, the iterative design, so sketching, wireframing, task flows are very important. So we're gonna dive into some of these areas later in the deck. And then this drives informed decisions for the interface. And that's really the aesthetic, the look and feel. So that's where we're gonna rely on design principles like layout, color, how we style our controls, action buttons, things like that. So on the next slide, we're gonna just go a little bit deeper into the difference, because I think it's really important to understand that they work together, but they're not the same thing. So user experience is strategic. It is the input that we get from the user. So when we talk about that, this is the holistic view from a user's perspective about the product, about the brand. And this is where we meet with users and we do analysis to really understand, what does a user need? What is going to give them value? We also look at different user groups to understand what are their skill sets and what are their pain points, areas where they're prone to make errors, so that we can design for that. And this is where we really want to empathize with the user. We want to understand their attitudes, their emotions, their frustrations about a product. And we look at measurable categories. So when we do user testing, we look at metrics so that we can validate how the interface works with the real user. And we do this by looking at all the different tasks. And we're gonna dive deep into what tasks mean, and user flows and task flows. And in a nutshell, this is the user experience, is how we drive informed decisions to make sure that there's quality and value perceived by the user. The interface is the output that's facing the user. So it's a byproduct of the research and the analysis that we do in the user experience. So this is really the look and feel, it's the skin, it's how we present all of the elements that a user is going to see on the screen. So these are the tangible elements. So we look at rules of color, layout, design, things like that. So next, I want to dive a little deeper into user experience. And on the next slide, we're going to talk about the fundamentals of user experience. So what you see here, many of you are probably already familiar with this. It's the user experience honeycomb. And if you look at the center, you see valuable. And that's because in order for a user experience to be valuable, we need to focus on all these other elements that you see around the valuable. So I'm going to talk through some of those now. And these are things to always keep in mind as you're designing interfaces for our user. So of course, we want the interface to be useful, right? A product or system should fill a need. If it's not fulfilling a user need or a user want, then there's really no purpose for it. Credibility. This relates to a user's ability to trust in the product, and not just that it's going to get the job done, but that it's going to last for a reasonable amount of time, and that any information that they're being given in the UI is accurate. Desirability is a really important one, and this is where UI comes in. The visual aesthetic obviously needs to be attractive, but also easy to understand. So we convey desirability through branding and images and identity. And this is important because the more desirable a product is, the more likely a user will recommend it to somebody else. So we always want to create desire around our products. usable. So we're going to dive deeper into all the different things that make a product usable, but this just means that a system should be simple. It should be easy. We want to design systems that are familiar to users, that are easy to understand, so that users can effectively and efficiently achieve their end objective. So basically, you want any learning curve in your UI to be quick and painless for a user. Findability, basically this means information needs to be easy to navigate and easy to find. It's really important when we talk about information architecture that the navigational structure is intuitive and makes sense to a user. We say if a user can't find it, it's not there. So this is an important one. And I do want to call out accessibility. I find that this is something that tends to be overlooked, but we really want to make sure that we understand accessibility principles, because our design should always allow for users with disabilities to have the same experience as other users. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about the VIM model. Many of the rules of UX that most of you are familiar with are actually derived from this VIM model. So when we talk about the VIM model, this is about understanding and accounting for human limitations. So, I'm sure many of you are familiar with rules like, we want to minimize the amount of clicks, or we want to reduce the amount of scrolling. So these rules come from the principles we're looking at here. So I want to walk through some of them. So when we talk about the visual load on a user, this is where we're optimizing that visual comprehension. So we want to make sure that we don't have visual clutter, because that's going to create difficulty in a user's ability to find things. And it doesn't matter how good something looks, if a user can't find what they need or do what they need to do, then we don't have that value there. So we find that visual clutter or visual noise is caused by screen flows that don't match user task flows. This is super important, so we're going to dedicate some time talking about how to do that in the next few slides. Anytime you have too much content on a page, that's going to reduce the visual comprehension for a user. And then, of course, layout. If we have haphazard layouts, bad alignment, bad formatting of text, too many calls to action, and I always like to call this out, too many harsh or clashing colors are going to make it difficult for the user to find what they're looking for. Intellectual complexity. This is where we make users figure things out. So we want to make sure that we're avoiding confusion navigation labels. We want to make sure we're paying attention to any overly complex workflows and how we guide users through those with the UI, and we'll go through some examples of that. We also want to make sure, any instructions that we're providing should be clearly written, not using technical jargon. Memory. We tax a user's memory load when we force them to remember things. So, we want to make sure we're not hiding important functions behind menus or tabs so that users can't remember how to get to them once they found them. Also workflows that are really convoluted, that users may forget where they are in the process. We want to make sure that we're always giving status updates so a user knows where they are, they can remember how to get back. We want to make sure that we're designing for users to rely on what we call recognition over recall. And you're going to hear me talk about this a lot. What we want to do is make sure we're providing clear navigational feedback. So users should always know where they are, where they're going, how they got there, how to get back. A user should never feel stuck or trapped in a UI. And when a user revisits the same UI, they shouldn't have to remember how to find the information. Think about that as a user. When you've seen that piece of information, you've navigated through this before, but now you can't remember how to find it. That should never be the case. We always want to design for you to be able to recognize what's there, not have to kind of dig around and try to remember. So we want to make sure that options are visible and that we provide sensible, intuitive defaults for the user. Motor load. This is especially critical on small devices, right? So this is where we're looking at really reducing movement and interaction time. So when we're designing for smaller devices, we want to make sure that the UI doesn't demand too many physical movements or too many overly precise physical movements where you can't click on what you're trying to click on. We want to make sure there's not excessive clicking or excessive typing. And we want to minimize device switching. So that's when you're moving from a keyboard to a mouse. This is especially important when we talk about accessibility. You want to have the ability to tab through fields. Of course, we want to minimize that rule we hear about to avoid excessive scrolling, especially horizontally. That relates to the motor load on a user. And of course, we don't want to present, small, hard to hit targets, and we don't want to have large distances between targets. It should be easy. So if you're holding a mobile device and you have a target on top and a target on bottom that you need to interact with together, that would be a bad UI. You want to make sure that we're improving motor comprehension by simplifying task flows and providing short distances between targets. So we really want to, when we talk about optimizing for the input device, that doesn't mean, oh, it's accessible, on mobile or tablet. We really want to optimize. So we want to make sure that our navigation and the content is going to be responsive. And, like I said, we want to make sure we're going to allow for any keyboard, common keyboard shortcuts, as I said, kind of tabbing through form fields. So this is the foundation of how we account for human limitations and really bring psychology, the science, into the art of design. So on the next few slides, I want to walk through some examples of how we've done this. So if you take a look here, we're looking at the Crestron, the online flip top configurator. And this is a good example of visual comprehension. We're matching the user task flow to the screen flow to allow for a guided experience. We have really simplified the UI by eliminating any unnecessary elements. So we really don't want to have, any UI bling that doesn't have value. Everything on the screen should have value to a user, whether it's information or it's an actionable item. Another thing that's extremely important for visual comprehension is to have clear, concise labels so that users can easily scan and find the information that they want. And we support that by making sure that we're carefully aligning and formatting our text. And I can't stress this enough. If you look at this example, we've used color judiciously. So it's really important that we are purposeful in our use of color. So pay attention to that as we're looking at some of these examples. So in the next slide, we're going to take a look at optimizing intellectual comprehension for users. So again, we want to make sure when a user looks at an interface that they shouldn't have to figure anything out, right? We have very clear titles. We're using everyday language. So that's important too. We want to eliminate any jargon. The way a designer may say something or the way an engineer may say something might be very different than how a user says it. So we want to make sure that we understand what the user's language is and that we accommodate for that so that they can easily find what they're looking for. So here what we did is we took a workflow and we simplified it to present visual tiles. So these are familiar controls. We call that button affordance. Affordance means that something does what it looks like it's going to do. So we want to make sure that our controls, if they're clickable, they look clickable. If they're not, they don't. Looking here again, as I said, the color is used very carefully. When we're dealing with icons, we want to make sure that we're using icons intuitively. So concepts that are familiar to people. System status is noted here. That's very obvious to users. And looking at this UI, this is actually a good example of visual optimization because we have useful grouping. labels, and as I said, purposeful use of color. And it's also actually a good example of motor load on a user, which we'll go into on the next slide, because you see here you have large targets and close distances, so you can the user can easily interact with what they need to. On the next slide, we're going to talk about motor load. So as I mentioned, this is really important on smaller devices. So when we think about optimizing that motor load for a user, we want to make sure we're optimizing the UI for the screen size. So as I said, you know, not just design for one size and then say, well, it's accessible, it comes up on a smaller device. We want to optimize that experience. So it's not just it shows up, but that it's working the best way that it can for a user, no matter what device they're looking at it on. We want to make sure that we have no full screen scrolling. That can be frustrating. And as I said, we want to have large, easy to hit targets. So moving along, we're going to start to talk about the psychology. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about the memory load. This is super important. So when we talk about memory load, and I say this all the time, recognition over recall. So what we mean by that is basically walk-up usability. There's nothing that a user should have to know already or remember to interact with an application. So I think an ATM machine is an example I like to use. Doesn't matter what bank you go to, when you want to use an ATM machine, they all work the same. You recognize how to use it. You don't have to remember specific instructions. So when we're designing to optimize for a memory load, everything should be straightforward, familiar, and we want to make sure that UIs are consistent with the user's mental model of how things work. So in this case, with their mental model of making a phone call. Now we're going to talk about the psychology of UX. So what I think is really cool about UX is how science and art meet. So I want to talk about, this is very fascinating, how psychology impacts user experience. And there's a tremendous amount of information. We're going to talk about a few of these principles. So when we look at the von Rostroff effect, it's also known as the isolation effect. This basically is telling us, make sure that you're taking important information, key actions, and make them visually distinctive. And this is why it's important for visual comprehension that we're careful about color use. So visually contrasting items will have a higher chance of being noticed and recalled. So it does optimize that visual comprehension for a user. And if you think about it, we use these principles in the real world when you're reading a book or you're reading information and you're highlighting important pieces of information. And this sort of allows the brain to better focus on those specific words so that you're able to retain them better. The next principle that we're going to talk about is the serial position effect. This is also known as the primacy and recency effect, and it basically means that we're going to notice the first and last items in a series, and that's horizontally, vertically. This applies to why when we think about the alphabet, that what stands out is ABC, XYZ. So the serial position effect is incredibly useful for content hierarchy on screens, as you can see here. So it's always important. You want to lead with the most significant content, and then you want to end on a high and kind of reserve those middle positions for the less critical information. This is also something to think about if you're conducting user research and you're using surveys. You want to make sure that you're conducting surveys the right way, and that's what you want to do is shuffle the list of positions for the answers for each vote, and that's going to reduce your margin of error because users are going to be prone to the first and last. This UI too, before we move to the next slide, is also a good example of the last effect we looked at, the isolation effect, because you can see that color is being used to make important actions visually distinctive. This is one of my favorite principles. It seems pretty straightforward, but I see this get violated a lot, so I want to talk about it. There's a psychologist, his name is Gestalt, and he has a theory of principles, and one of them is the law of proximity. And all this means is that items or elements that are close to one another are perceived as a group rather than those that are spaced far apart. Sounds pretty straightforward, but a lot of times I'll see an area where a user is working in, let's say they're entering data or information, and then you're looking for the save button or the undo button. It's in a totally different spot. So that's an example of not using the law of proximity. We want to make sure that all the controls and functions that belong together are together. It's important because people don't read. When people are looking at an interface, they're typically going to scan. So we want to group functions that belong together so that users are able to easily find what they're looking for. So in this example, you can see the keypad numbers are grouped with a border. The channel functions here, such as the arrows and the plus minus, the option buttons, each of them are grouped by visual characteristics that belong together. So, that could be shape, color, size, orientation, and that's what triggers the user to understand that these functions belong together. And we also use white space to create the distinction between the different groups of objects. So that's important too. Doesn't mean that we need to put a dark border or background colors around everything. White space is a really great way to provide different groups of information in a really clean, simple way that users can digest. And if you look at that resume button in the upper right-hand corner, that's an important function for users. And it's a good example of the isolation effect because we used the color red there. Okay, so the Hick-Hyman law. Basically what this means is the more options and the more complex the options, the harder it is to make a decision. The time it takes to make a decision increases. So this law plays a critical role on small screens or devices with limited space. So remote controls are a good example of designing by categorizing related functions for the user so that you reduce the time it takes them to complete an action. Also good use of the law of proximity. And why is this important? This is essential because a significant way that we measure effective usability is how quickly a user can complete a task. So actually a wizard is another good UX example of this principle, guiding users through what they need to do at any given moment rather than overwhelming them with options. This is also a good example of prioritizing a primary user task with the Van Rostroff isolation effect. So we're using color here on the power button to make it visually distinctive. And when I say primary user task, this is when we're talking about user tasks and we're looking at an interface. You want to think about what is the primary task, and that means something that every user is always going to do, right? So when we pick up a remote, we're always going to need to access that on-off button. And that's where you want to think about applying these principles in your design so that they jump out and they're clear to users. Okay, so
Karen,
now.
Hey, Karen, I think this would be actually a great time to ask our audience a quick question. I think
Yes.
it'd be kind of fun to find out which evaluation method is based on performance and not subjective opinion as you're about to jump into user-centered analysis and user testing. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll for us. And everyone take a chance where they think which evaluation method is based on performance and not subjective opinion, which would be great. And while we're doing that, there are quite a few questions that have come up, both in chat and in the question and answer section about designing for color blindness. I don't know if you want to take a second to maybe discuss that a little bit and to why and how people can address those kind of concerns in their design.
Sure, and that it's a great question. I'm glad people are asking about it because I think a common misconception when and that's part of designing for accessibility. And something that I see as a common mistake is maybe using a bright color or bolding something, which is great. That makes something distinctive. But when we're talking about color blindness, that's not always going to solve the problem. So a recommendation and things that we do to make items stand out for someone who is colorblind is you want to use a background that has a pattern. So not just a background, because that might not solve the problem, but using a background that has a pattern in it. And there's actually a lot of great information available on how to design for accessibility, particularly color blindness. So I can send out more information about that.
That'd be great.
But that's a quick tip. Always remember that only using color or bolding something is not going to be enough. Think about something that's going to stand out. So maybe just kind of a background border that has little dots on it or stripes on it, things like that.
Great. Why don't we go and end our poll and let's share our results. It looks like which evaluation method is based on performance, not subjective opinions, and 64% indicated user testing and 36% indicated user analysis. Karen, perhaps you could explain to us a little bit better what the differences are and which one applies where.
Yeah, so that's what we're going to do now. I know that there's a lot of ambiguity around user testing. It's something that's talked about often, but I think user-centered analysis often gets kind of clumped in together. So I really want to talk about the difference between the two and share some of the techniques that we use. So when we're talking about user-centered analysis, this is how we proactively collect user data for a new product or a redesign. So this is something that we do early, and we do this in the form of interviews, surveys, focus group, workshops. So when you think about those techniques, these are going to be much more open-ended. This is where we want to gather information from the user about how they think, how they work, what their expectations are, what are the pain points that we need to solve for, and what motivates them. So that's analysis. Proactive happens earlier on. User testing is how we evaluate an existing design, and we do this with real users. So when I say existing design, I do want to clarify that user testing can happen at any phase of the iterative design process. And when I say iterative design, I mean, we can test users with a low fidelity prototype, so a wireframe, a sketch, all the way through to mock-ups, to functioning prototypes, or even if we have a live product and we want to kind of benchmark the experience and make improvements. So the distinction with user testing is we really want to watch the user, observe the user, interact with the tool, so it's more performance-based, it's more fact-based. So we're going to talk more about the details of user-centered analysis and user testing to really drill into the differences between the two. So let's jump into user-centered analysis. So UCA, or user-centered analysis, is really a routine scientific method we use to help eliminate guesswork, debating, and passionate, conflicting opinions. And this ties into the honeycomb that we reviewed earlier. So if you look at this focus on usability, this is what we want to focus on. So as we're talking to users to understand, who are our users and how do they think, how do they work? Because I'm not the user, our developers aren't the user. So it's important, yeah, we might know about the user, but we really want to get in their heads and understand their expectations, because when we focus on error prevention or ease of learning, those things are going to be different for the end user than they are for us. So we want to make sure that we're accounting for all of that. So are users able to complete their tasks without making mistakes? Are they able to remember enough to be able to reuse the interface without having to relearn it? Do they like the interface? Do they find it fun, easy, effective? Would they recommend it to somebody? Ease of learning. How quickly can a new user figure out how to use things? It should be quick. Effectiveness. Are they able to achieve what they need, right? Because otherwise, what's the value? And the efficiency of use. So how quickly can users complete a task, right? So, and we can measure these. There's a ton of different ways to measure these. You know, we can do it by time to complete a task. We can look at accuracy. There's tons of different metrics that we can identify and use. And really, these are all the things we do to optimize that VIM model that we reviewed. So visual, intellectual, memory, and motor load on a user. The next thing I want to talk about, super important, is a user's mental model. So no one's a blank slate, right? We all have preconceived notions of how something should work, right? And this could be influenced by someone's experience with the product, with the actual product. It can be conversations with other users. It can be experience with similar products, right? And the conceptual model is the actual product UI. So if a user's mental model matches what the product is actually trying to do, then users perceive it as easy to use. So that's kind of tying in all the focus on usability that we're looking at. So let's go a little deeper into mental models, because I think this is extremely important. So on the next slide, if you look at designing for a user's mental model, this is how we prevent a user's chances of getting lost and eventually giving up on the product. So one of the major reasons why products fail is too wide of a gap between the user's mental model and the mental model of the designers or the engineers. So it's extremely important that we are designing for patterns that users are accustomed to. We want to use natural, intuitive gestures. You know, think of swiping, things that are going to match real life actions or real expectations. And mirroring well-known UIs is a great way of doing this. And you know, innovation is great, and we definitely want to be creative and come up with new ideas, but we do have proven principles too, so we don't always need to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes it's more effective to mirror well-known UIs, and you know, you have to do very little testing to verify that your core functions are going to be usable, because we already know that users are familiar with it. So I want to do a quick little exercise here. So as I said, intuitive user experiences are going to result from the interface's conceptual model matching the user's mental model. So we don't just want to reflect the underlying system. I'm going to say that a lot because that's really, really important. So let's do this quick exercise. So I want you to picture this. Imagine that you are a man, you're walking into a department store. So, you know, imagine you're walking into the front door of Macy's or, you know, any department store, and you want to buy a pair of boots. And think about what that experience would look like. This is your mental model. And if you look at these examples on the screen and see which one matches. So the one on the left, you would walk into a department store, you would find a shoe section, you would start searching through the boots and pick out men's boots. Or would you walk through those doors, find the shoe department, look for the men's section, and then find the boots? So if we go to the next slide, the reason this is so important, and I think we all know the answer, right? The reason this is so important is because the mental model of a user really sets the expectations, which is going to drive and shape their behavior. So, like I said, based on prior experiences, we have very specific mental models when we're using a product, or even when we're trying to apply those to a new product. So this is a very simplistic example because I wanted to get the point across. But if you think about this with RUIs, much more complex tasks, if this becomes critical. So here you see that the navigation to purchase shoes on a department store website matches the layout of the store. So that's why we talk about mental models and conceptual models and how important those are. So I want to talk a little bit more about, so this all falls into user-centered analysis. This is all of the input and information that we get from users. So why do we need to know a user's mental model? We need to understand what tasks a user has and how they're going to achieve that end goal. So when we talk about user tasks, a task consists of steps to accomplish the goal, and we design based on user task flows. Again, not just the underlying flow of the system, but how a user thinks and how a user works. So it's important for us to understand the flow of those tasks. Is there a standard flow? Are there different ways to accomplish the same thing? Do the tasks have sequential dependencies? Are they going to happen in a certain order? Does one thing need to happen before the next? Are there certain triggers? Are there certain priorities? Those are the things that we capture in a task flow. And of course, we always want to prevent errors from happening. We try to do that as much as possible, but there are some areas which might be extremely complicated. So we want to make sure we're identifying pain points where mistakes can happen and then determine, how we can work around those. So moving along, as I said, a task, when we talk about a task flow, from a UX perspective, we're talking about the flow of the user, not the flow of the system. So a task consists of steps, and those steps are how we accomplish the user goal. So we move from high-level tasks to the steps to the page or the screen flow. So obviously when you're working with an interface, you're going to have different tasks. Some of them may be broken into subtasks, and then each task is going to have steps. Maybe you have one step, which is represented on one screen. You could have multiple steps represented on one screen, or you can have one very complicated step that gets broken up across screens. So this is kind of an example of how that flow happens. And this all is the process of getting that input from the user so that we understand how to design for their needs. Now we're going to talk about user testing. This is a term many of you are familiar with, so I want to kind of go through the different distinctions and how this differs from the user analysis.
So Karen, before we jump into this section, I think it'd be great to ask our audience a quick poll, and let's ask them, how many users should you test with to uncover approximately 80% of usability problems? And it's an important question to look at and think about. And while we've been talking about all the analysis that we're putting together, in today's world, one of the things that is coming up more and more and more is a complete change in the user experience. Touch is something people are now potentially afraid of, and they want that no-touch automated user experience. And how people can create an analysis of the needs of a customer to create that automated no-touch experience, I think ties quite nicely into what you've been discussing. But instead of dealing with the visual aspect of it, you're actually dealing with the design of the automation of the experience, creating visual stimulus and results that end up on screens in the rooms and that guide people to a solution for a automated experience that does not require touch. Is that a fair approach and statement in what I'm saying, Karen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and let's
I'm
wrap
curious
up our
to see
poll.
the results.
Yep, I'm going to wrap up our poll and let's share the results. So the leading answer that people believe is 27% stated 6 to 10 people. The next one we have is 10 to 20. The next highest from there is 5, and then we space it out between the other groupings. And I think you're going to cover this a little bit further on in your presentation. So
Yep,
why don't we go ahead and...
we're gonna get there soon.
Great, fantastic. Thanks, Karen.
All right, so let's jump into user testing. So before we jump into how many users, want to talk about what user testing is and what it's not. So usability testing is not the design or development team or friends or colleagues being asked opinions about a design solution, if you remember from the question we had earlier. So in order to perform user testing, we need to understand what the user tasks are, right? So user testing is not, do you like this? It's, you know, what do you think of this color? What's your opinion? User testing, really, the best way is observing users with an emphasis on performing tasks, right? So we need to know those tasks. And this really enables us to validate, is the new design better than the previous system? Where are, you know, it should be done often and early throughout the iterative process so we can determine, you know, where are their mistakes, how do we correct those? And you know what I love about this is it is scientific, so it really empowers us to say, you know, we know from research that we should do it this way, not, you know, oh, I think it should be like this. So now I want to talk about sample size. So many companies shy away from the practice of usability testing, believing it involves a lot of resources and expenses. And that's why I thought that that would be an interesting poll to do. So the reality is, despite these misconceptions about how cumbersome the process is, you really only need 5 test users per user group to make sure that your product is really offering a smooth experience. So it's this huge misconception that more participants will uncover more design issues. What ends up happening is you get that law of diminishing returns. So more participants will produce more reliable results, but fewer new results. So that's something important to remember. It doesn't need to be, you know, this huge cumbersome process. So we just want to make sure we're validating with, you know, at least 5 users. And when I say per user group, you know, you may have different types of users with different permissions, different access, different tasks. So you want to test for each of those. So when we talk about user testing, we test on prototypes. And remember, when I say prototype, I am talking about the iterative design process that we use in UX. So testing can be done, as I said, very early on with a paper wireframe, or it can be done, you know, all the way at the prototype level. And it really depends on what you're testing with. But the whole idea is we want to validate if users' expectations are being met. So as I said, prototypes can be high fidelity, low fidelity. Now, one thing to keep in mind though is if we are testing low fidelity, like a wireframe like you see here, we're obviously not going to be testing the visual design, right? We can't test graphical treatments and user controls, but this is where we can test the user flow. Is this the order you would expect to see things in? Are these the steps you would expect to take? Does this word make sense in the navigation? What would you expect to happen here? So let's take a look at the different areas of design that we look at and how we test each of those. So we have 4 focal points of design that user testing can validate. So all it evaluates all dimensions of design. So you have navigation. So this is where we're looking at, you know, how the information architecture, which again, IA is not just how things are laid out, but it's also how we're labeling things, what we're calling things, how we're organizing the menu, and of course your page and your screen structure. Right, then we have presentation. So this is going to be more of that visual design, layout, color, imagery. So that's going to be later on. Content, right? So we want to look at the visible options, the functionality of the different tasks, the actual content, and interaction, right? So as I mentioned, do buttons and controls have visual affordance? Does something look clickable if it's supposed to be? Or if something is clickable, does it actually do something? And the task flows that we were talking about, feedback, things like that. So all dimensions of design can be tested with user testing. So I want to talk just a little bit about different types of testing and how to use them, and then we can go through an example of a user test. So quickly looking through these, the top one is performance tests, and this is really the most effective because you're actually observing users interacting with your product. So when we talk about performance testing, you can really evaluate anything you want to evaluate. You typically will have tasks or user scenarios and ask the user to carry that out while thinking out loud so that we can determine, are they making mistakes? Where are they making mistakes? When we want to test very early on and make sure that we're understanding the mental model, so that task flow, we can do what's called an expectancy test. So that's a little more open-ended. Again, it's earlier on, so that can be showing something to a user, even if it's a wireframe, and saying, look at this interface. Tell me what you would expect to find when you click here. And this helps us validate that we're laying things out in a way that a user would expect to find them. Card sorting, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and this is when we look at different high-level IA categories and determine how to organize the structure of the navigation and what to call things. So we're not using technical jargon, we're using language that makes sense to the user. And then, of course, we have the visual affordance test, similar to the expectancy test, only with the visual affordance test, we validate the quality of visual designs to make sure that a user is understanding how to use an object. So, where can you click? What would you expect this button to do? Things like that. And this is obviously where we're looking at visual design, task flows, layout, and controls. So next thing I want to do is talk about some user testing that was conducted to optimize the interface for Crestron for the Mercury product. So obviously this was built from a collection of products that emulated the capabilities that were planned for the device. So what we did is, if we go to the next screen, what we did is we had study groups. We had them focus on tasks. So, whether it was book a room, share your screen, things like that. And we asked them to think aloud with the prototype. And the sessions were recorded so that the UX team could listen, go back, and we discovered a lot of opportunities for improvement. So on the next screen, we're going to look at, on the left was the original design, on the right is the redesign. So you can see we have a much more efficient task flow. The first task, so again, primary task when you come to the room, is to reserve the space. So we emphasize that by a clear call to action. We also took the navigation and we converted that to a flat tab navigation model, and it was modernized to a pull-up menu. So now it's a much cleaner interface. We're optimizing for the visual load, for the intellectual load. There's less to figure out. The user is really just presented with the most relevant information and options that they need when they need it. On the next screens, we're going to be looking at some of the other optimizations that were made. So This new menu model provides a much more intuitive subcategory navigation. So this helps to support users. This helps to support user-driven tasks. So they make a selection and then they get the relevant selections. And it also allows for more scalability as the user can swipe to see the rest of the subcategories. Another thing we did was invert the color on the background for the phone call. So we gave that added feedback to signify that the user's in an active call. And it provides to the users, again, most relevant information about the meeting room, the name, the status, and the time remaining. Just whatever they would need to know in that moment. So before we wrap up on user testing and user analysis, again, I just want to do kind of a side-by-side to compare them and highlight again, when we talk about user-centered analysis, this happens early. This is our approach to gather information for design definition when a product either doesn't exist or we're fundamentally tearing it down and redesigning. The usability testing approach is to evaluate something that exists or, as we're iterating against that usability. And performance tasks, I find, really help refine outcomes for those focal points of design for the navigation, presentation, interaction, and content. And I find that expectancy tests also help to really refine the outcome a little more based on subjective feedback. But again, we're observing users, so we're understanding better how they interact. Something else that I don't actually hear talked about a lot, but I think is really, really important is a topic called evidence-based UX. So the process of doing user analysis and user testing is a scientific process, and we should be doing it routinely. But there are times when we really don't need to reinvent the wheel. There is so much research that's out there that is evidence-based already. So this is such a good tool to use when you don't have that customer touch point available to you. So evidence-based UX is kind of that happy medium that it strikes a balance between this kind of unrealistic notion that, we can just predict anything, but we don't want to have this open-ended and intuition-based design. So it's that happy medium where we can rely on existing research and, we can look at, there's so much information out there. We have guidelines from recognized authorities, so we can always use that information. We can leverage usability testing that we've done on other products. Metrics is a great way to collect information and make decisions off of those. And then, of course, any feedback that we get from users of the existing system or related systems, we can take into account. And then, of course, you have your secondary forms like error reports, and then help desk calls, support requests, emails, phone calls. That stuff is so important to capture because it's our customer's voice. And obviously the benefits of evidence-based UX are going to have the same benefits that user experience has, but we're able to leverage methods that were already successful. Obviously, this is great to use when you need to save time and budget, and you don't need to develop something from scratch. So this is a great tool to have, and I find that people are always excited when I bring this up because it really kind of gives you that middle ground when you're not able to meet with users directly. Okay, so this is a great topic. As we're moving more and more into this world of HTML5, we get a lot more flexibility in terms of being creative. And as much as we want to be creative and we want to make things look good, we also need to make sure that we're doing user-focused designs. I'm going to talk about what that means. So what we're looking at now is a little more of the old-fashioned model of, okay, here's this huge list of requirements, and take this, make it look good, you know, slap some paint on it and just make it look good. And this is what I call feature focused design. And of course, we want to design for the features, but we want to make sure we're focusing on how we bridge that gap between the features and the users. So we don't want to do strictly feature focused design. It's an outdated way of working, and it doesn't account for our users. And I just love this quote because I really think it explains it nicely. I think that often when you hear the word design, it just sounds kind of like artsy, but it's when we talk about user experience design, it's not just about how something looks. In fact, it's how it works. That's the crux of UX. So we want to make sure that we're focusing on that and that we're accounting for that. So when we talk about user-focused design, right, rather than looking at this list of requirements that we got to kind of check off, we're looking at what are our customers' problems? Like, what is the real user problem? And then we're looking to our UX professionals to help us solve that problem, right? Going through the process that we talked about, discovering who our users are, coming up with ideas, creating those and validating those with users. And this is what I call user-focused design. So this is what we want to do. And I'm going to walk through a case study right now to talk about how we did that. So what we're looking at now is the Crestron flip-top web configurator. This is an online tool. On the left, you see the original version, which I call feature focused. And the UX team was not involved with this design. And then on the right, we have the user focused design. So if you take a look, you can see here on the left, this kind of reflects the underlying system architecture, right? It doesn't look like a user flow. The feature-focused design, rather than user-focused design, is ultimately going to result in a heavier load on the user. So all those different areas that we talked about in the VIM model. So we want to focus on business goals, but we also want to focus on user tasks and kind of bring those together, which results in a much cleaner and more intuitive UI. And that's what you see on the right-hand side. And this was accomplished by applying all of those UX principles that we reviewed. So typically, when we focus only on features, we end up with a much more complicated UI. But you know, things like unclear options, it's going to cause frustration, and it also causes what we call decision paralysis when you have everything all up front like that, and that's going to prevent users from taking action, or it's going to delay their ability. So some of the feedback that we got were that users were having a really hard time configuring the flip top without support. So the goal was to enable users to be able to go through the process seamlessly, easily, not have to remember how to do it next time, and be able to do it on their own without support. So the new interface was optimized so that primary tasks, which I discussed, are apparent, and then secondary tasks are a click away. So, you know, I think that's important to talk about because, as I mentioned, I know a very popular theory in UX is, you know, you want to minimize clicks. You don't want to have extra clicks. And that's very valid, especially when we're talking about optimizing a motor load. But when having everything up front is going to compromise the visual load, the user's ability to find things, or the comprehension for the user, at that point it becomes a trade-off. So we want to make sure we're focused on the primary user task, and it's okay to have the subcategories a click away. This was really a result of the UX team. We didn't just look at the design and say, all right, we're going to mock up something new. We took a step back and we needed to assess what a user would really want to do and when they would want to do it. So, you know, one of the things that we focused on is a user can only keep so many items in their working memory at a time. This is important. So it's really critical to focus designs around what a user needs to do. So every single thing that you see on the screen should add value. And in the new design, it does. So I want to walk through the process that we took to arrive there. So if you're looking on the left here, what we did is a user task analysis and screen flow. So before starting to consider any design elements, it was important for the UX to understand how the user would interact with the tool. So the first step in the redesign was what you see here, documenting the existing screen flows and user actions. And I'm calling it screen flow, not user flow, because what you see in the blue boxes, those are each of the screens. And then underneath it are the different user actions. So the UI was, again, really just surfacing kind of that underlying architecture without UX consideration. But if you look at the new user flow, and we're calling this user flow, we uncovered issues in the journey, and then we made optimizations for the new user flow, and that translated into much more intuitive screens. So what we talked about, your tasks, your steps, your actions. So this is really the blueprint. This is how we figure out, all right, what do we need to design for? On the left, you see the new user flow, and on the right, you see the wireframe. And this was the result of a high-level user flow where we decided to create a guided experience to walk users through each task that needs to be completed so that they could arrive at their end goal. So understanding those user goals is how we resulted in this much more focused experience and cleaner interface. So I want to kind of walk through the different screens. So we start with low fidelity wireframes. We do this for conversation, and you'll notice there's no color. The reason is we really want to focus with the wireframe on your basic page design, your task flows, the user-centered design, the user experience, not the look and feel yet. We want to make sure that we're supporting the user's actual interaction with the system. Make sure we're nailing down those requirements and we're doing it in line with how a user would expect to see it. So wireframes, this is where we organize, we discover, we explore different options, right? This isn't set in stone. So we're really just defining the bare bones structure of the tool. And it's important because when we take this iterative process, it's much easier to change low fidelity quickly, and we're focusing on the right things. We're not focusing on, is it blue, is it purple, is it flashy? We're focusing on where is the navigation place? Can users find it? Is the main content area clear? Things like that. Once we get agreement on that, that's when we move to high fidelity visual design. I love this part. This is where we commit to those ideas and concepts and the solution. And now we start to really flesh out the UI. So we add in the colors, the typefaces, the styles, we design the usable controls, the user controls, the button actions. And again, remember, we can test at any phase of these. And I love this part because this is where we really see the designs come to life. So I want to take a look at some of the UX improvements that we made, and I want to call out some of the principles that we applied here. So if you take a look here, this is where the user lands. We optimize the screen flow to remove bottlenecks to entry. So I didn't show a screenshot, but on the old UI, you had to fill out a form, click through a bunch of different steps to fill out input fields just to get into the configurator. And nobody likes to do that, right? When you're confronted with a form and you have to keep clicking through just to get where you want to go, that does not match a user's mental model. So we wanted to create something, a new interface that was simplified for the simplified steps for the user. And so it's really easy for them to get started. They choose their model, they choose their finish, and they click build. So once they come into the experience, we added what we call a persistent sequential navigation, and it provides structure for that step-by-step tasks. And we also allow users to jump between related steps. So in this case, it's not mandatory per se that you select the power before the accessory, stuff like that. So if there are cases where you have sequential dependencies, right, then you wouldn't allow for that. But in this case, that wasn't an issue. So the guided interface really allows users to feel like they're in control. User control is an important principle of user experience. We want to make sure that we're providing information, options, system status, and we want to do it in a natural, logical order for users. Something that I don't see a lot that's a pet peeve of mine is when you get into a screen and then you can't figure out how to get back, or there is no way back. We never want a user to feel trapped, or if they selected the wrong model, they should easily be able to go back and change that. So we accounted for that in the upper left-hand corner with that change type option. And we in UX, that's called an emergency exit. That allows users to easily navigate back to the start screen. So again, I said this before and I'll repeat it because it's so important. It's a mistake I see a lot. When you're designing your interfaces, you need to make sure that your user understands, where am I? How did I get here? How did I get back? How do I get back? And it's also great, you know, if there are steps that need to be taken or percentages that need to be completed to move forward, you want the user to know. It's very, and that's why we have the steps numbered across the top as opposed to only having next, next, next. You want to feel that you understand where you are and how much longer you have to go. This helps keep users engaged and not likely to abandon your interfaces. So next screen, again, we have that step-by-step guidance, as I mentioned, which creates that explicit navigation paths and helps to guide users through task completion. So we want to move them forward through the experience. And as I said, it lets users accurately predict what they have to do next. Users are kept informed about the results of each of their actions, right? So when they make a selection, they get an update to provide that selection. So we really provide that interface status through appropriate feedback. It's important too, anytime a user is triggering something, if they select something, if they're waiting for something to load, you want to provide that feedback to the user so they understand their selection's been made or they're waiting for something to happen. You want to keep the user engaged. And again, we numbered those steps. So there's very clear progress cues and we're reducing the potential for user errors. Something else we did, and we kind of grayed those out, but we added pricing options and they became configurable. So we allow for user freedom there. So it's configurable based on user type. So, whether it's a dealer, whether it's a MSRP, or, whether we want to do no price. We added buttons on the bottom. The next button is added support for that user sense of control. And it also has a lot to do with optimizing for motor load, and one of the principles that we talked about earlier. So if the user is looking at the connectors, the retractors, and they're making their selection, we're giving them the ability to just move their mouse down and click next, as opposed to moving it up, right? So larger distances, longer time to complete action. And as we mentioned, getting through the task quickly is a metric that measures effectiveness of usability. So, it's just so cool to kind of talk through how each of these decisions are made and why. They're not arbitrary. There's really that science behind them. We also added the save function that was not there before. So we were able to improve the efficiency and allow users to tailor frequent actions. So basically when they save, now they can save a template for reuse. Always think about that too. When you're designing, you may just have one use case where, okay, somebody's configuring a flip top, but very often in an interface, users will want to repeat actions, whether it's, select 100 items at the same time and edit them, or whether it's save a template. What you want to do is just make sure you're not just being myopic, but you're really thinking about every possibility. Think about your users and the different ways they're going to want to interact, and accommodate that. So this save button to allow users to have a template, again, is going to speed up their workflow, make the tool easier to use, and improve user satisfaction. Next page we're looking at, once the user goes through and they land on the accessories, we decided to provide what we call smart recommendations for accessories. So these are defaults, and that's something you always want to do too. You don't want to make the user think. If the system can do it for them, provide defaults anywhere you can. Now, granted, as long as you know those defaults, and we don't want to make assumptions, but when we know recommendations, we want to make those for a user. So, you know, whatever's most relevant for them, surface that up for them. But we do obviously give them the ability to filter that if they want to, you know, look through all. I want to talk about the search bar. So the search was something that was not there that we added. And search is actually a form of primary navigation. So if you think about your experiences as a user interacting with an interface, if you know what you're looking for, we call this known item scenario, search is going to be your primary and most efficient form of navigation. So it's really important that we present it that way. So just some tips to think about when you're designing a search bar. You want to make sure, obviously, it's in a prominent area of the screen, right? If that was on the bottom of the screen, you probably wouldn't find it. Doesn't make sense there. You always want to make sure that the text entry, if you can, is wide enough to accommodate the text string. And I think it's always a good idea to place guidance text in the search field so that users are clear on the search criteria. So, you know, again, think about yourself as a user. If you're searching and you're not getting results and you don't know why you're getting results, that's frustrating. This is a great form of error prevention. Let them know what they can look for. So those are some of the things that we added to the accessory screen right before the user gets to the final page in the experience. And the last screen is where they see the summary of the selections they've made. So the interface really provides a simple, visually guided experience to help users learn to use the tool. And again, I just kind of want to call out recognition over recall, which I said a few times. This is a great example because the interface is designed to facilitate recognition through visual cues to reduce a user's memory load. So users are not going to have to remember information to use the tool again. So this interface really accounts for all of the human limitations that we discussed in the Vim model. So these are principles that we can apply anywhere on any interface that we're designing. So it's really important that, you know, we understand those human limitations and that we make sure that we're never overloading a user's visual, intellectual, memory, or motor load.
So, you know, Karen, this is a great application. It takes a little bit away from the concept of what many of the attendees are here for, which is designing user interfaces for touchscreens. But with the new HTML5 capabilities coming out that we've already released, the capabilities of what our systems can do now evolves dramatically. And so the UI and the UX changes completely from the I'm going to control just my room, but rather we're able to now think about how you can create an entire user experience with a Crestron system running C# on a 4 series or virtual or VC4 processor and the HTML5 implementation to create something that is completely different. It's no longer about just controlling the conference room, the meeting room, the boardroom, but rather creating a user experience that encapsulates the entire operation of a facility, if you so want and choose. And so there's a lot of great opportunities to understand not only just programming for what our programmers know about, which is UI for AV, but really to begin to think beyond that, to begin to think of implementing designs that can create phenomenal experiences that are fully automated with visual visual references that appear throughout the space to help them better understand what their ultimate goal is. And I think, I really appreciate how you've taken something that might be considered a web page, but apply it to overall design that applies to where we're going and what we're doing moving forward. And I think it's a really thing that's an important thing to understand, is that these courses don't just offer, this is the one way to do it, but rather these are the best practices you can implement and apply to your overall concepts and designs, which actually ties into what you're going to be talking about in a little bit, which is your reference material, where people can look for additional information, additional ideas, and to be able to really apply what you've discussed in this presentation to their designs on a large scale, and I think that really is important. There are some questions that people have been asking, because we actually have a little bit of time, that are related to mock-up strategies, because there are concerns that you may not have the budget in a project to do a UI demo or create something on the actual interface. And I kind of reference back to something we have talked about in other sessions, which is using a program design kit for your projects, which allows you to have a wireframe, which allows you to show a user experience for a system. And that is something I think that is always worth utilizing on a project. And even if it's a template you have for your company and for what you do as a design team, to be able to reference that in other projects and share with your end client is part of the interview process. Go through that user experience and mock up a system to be able to address that. Jonathan, do you want to add anything to that statement?
No, I think you're absolutely right, Rich. Programming Design Kit is a great place to start. Again, certainly you can wireframe from there. Again, people have been asking about, how does the Avixa dashboard for controls fit into that? And again, that's just another strategy that you can use to design a standard interface or a standard UI. It's an ideology that they brought forward from the concept of the car dashboard, where when you get into a vehicle, wherever you are around the world, you have a basic understanding of the controls, and they're going to land in some typical or standard positions. So bringing that ideology forward, again, helps you to ensure that you're developing a consistent and a standardized UI, something that doesn't require re-education of your user every time they go to use the system. So yeah, great, just again, a highlight of the tools and all of the opportunities that you can use to bring those things into fruition for a great UX, a great design.
And I do think that really is an important component to any of these conversations, is understanding that, we're talking overall concepts here. You now need to do your research. You now need to do your lookups and your interviews with your customers to create that great experience. Look at all the other wonderful reference material that's out there. And you know what? We all are going to have our user preferences. Some things like 2D skeuomorphic layouts. Some people like 3D layouts. Some people like monochromatic solutions. There's a hotel we did in one of the large casino hotels. Their entire layout in every panel, in every room, is black and white. The background is black, the text and the buttons are white. No graphics, language only. And when you walked into the room, based on your check-in, the language of your panel showed up, but you could always choose a different language if you wanted. So it's that type of understanding that it's not that Crestron is going to tell you, this is how your VC system has to work. This is how your home system has to work. But we can provide to you references, such as our Crestron Home solution, such as our Program Design Kit. Avixa's information is also very good as reference material. Look at what Zoom does. Look at what Microsoft does. Their UIs are completely different, and yet they control them very, very tightly. So
these are also ways that companies differentiate themselves, Rich.
Correct.
Right? And that's
Absolutely.
a thing that we've talked about in the past. When we talk about common interfaces that people use, people are comfortable with things like their iPhone or their Android device, and so they're two smartphones, two similar tools, but that have very different user experiences. They both have swipes, and the functions are similar, yet different or distinct. We've seen their icons change from round to square to rounded square to all of those things, 2D and 3D. So certainly, companies and organizations use these things to differentiate themselves, to create, again, those unique user experiences that highlight either their product or their function or their service.
Absolutely. And in fact, we actually have Crestron service providers who all they do is create UIs and UXs, right? They just, that's their full-time job, is to create that type of product. Okay. We have dealers who have a dedicated team of developers who create user experiences and UIs for their product line. So it really is an important aspect that time needs to be allocated as part of the design of the overall system, incorporating the user experience flow with the technology you deploy. And I think, Karen, you've provided some wonderful references. These will be active links in the presentation, but perhaps you could tell us a little bit about these references here, Karen. I think that'd be a really great wrap up for the session. And if you could let us know what each one here is best suited for, I think our audience would appreciate that.
Sure. So Human Factors International, they're kind of the pioneers of user experience, as well as Nielsen Norman Group. They both offer certifications and a wealth of information. So you'll find that you'll find a lot of information with regards to that on both of those links. The Nielsen Norman Group, I believe I accessed some reports that I pulled statistics and information from. So I provided links to those. Mental models, this is a really great explanation. Again, I think it's really important. I just scratched the surface, but I definitely recommend reading further on that. User-focused design. So if you recall, I talked about the difference between feature-focused and user-focused design. And this is a great article where they actually tactically walk through taking a UI and applying UX principles to redesign it one element at a time. And what I love about this exercise is, in order to make it look better, they don't add stuff onto it. They take stuff away. They clean up the spacing. They create more clicks, but to create more of a less visual noise when you jump in. So that's a great exercise. I talked about some of the laws of UX, some of the different psychology. Here's where you'll find all of those with examples, and you'll find more. And this is just a good article on how to think about design from a developer perspective. I do see a really good question that I just want to answer. Somebody had asked a question about analysis, user analysis versus user testing. And they asked if that's the same thing as a qualitative versus quantitative research approach. That's such a good question. And I'm going to say yes. So when we talk about qualitative research, right, we're thinking about quality. This is where we're going to do surveys, focus groups, and get the user's input about the quality of the product, right? So that is going to happen early on. So yes, that is part of analysis. And then quantitative research, that's where we look at metrics, right? So that's not opinion-based, that's performance-based. So that is going to be user testing. So, I mean, there are so many different ways to, do your quantitative testing. A lot of it involves time, how long it takes to complete an action, how many steps it takes, things like that. So that's a great question. And it came from Aldo. You got the answer right. Yeah.
Great, Karen. Thank you so much.
Sure.
We are getting to the end of the session. So I do want to thank you, Karen, for presenting today. It was a wonderful session. I think we all learned a lot today about UX and UI and great design principles. I can actually say by the number of questions asked that people focused and paid attention and listened to you, which is wonderful, because they were actually asking very relative and relevant questions, which is wonderful. Jonathan, thank you for supporting us. Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Carl. We really appreciate it. Want to let everyone know our next session is Tuesday, May 27th. It is at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. This is going to be a session on how to successfully plan and deploy large-scale systems. We're going to talk about auto update. We're going to talk about PowerShell. We're going to talk about XIO Cloud. We are going to reference some additional courses that will be taking place in June. These are really good design sessions for how to plan to deploy large-scale systems. And that's what we're going to cover on Tuesday, May 27th. That's the MTA 206 Master's Technology Architect course.
Correction, Rich. It's the 26th is Tuesday.
I'm sorry, it's the 26th.
26th, yes.
I'm sorry,
Tuesday's
you're right.
The 26th.
You're right. It is the 26th. You're right. My apologies. Thank you, Jonathan. It is May 26th is Tuesday. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that correction. We want to thank you all for joining us. We are going to stop our recording in just a second, but once again, thank you all for joining us. Be safe, be healthy. We are going to stick around, go through some of the questions that came up in the channel, and open up for a live conversation. Be well. We'll talk to you soon. See you on Tuesday, May 26th. Thanks all.
Everyone.